And joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, in Washington, D.C., Eric Olson, Senior Associate with the Mexico Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. In New York, New York, Nick Steinberg, Mexico researcher in Human Rights Watch's Americas Division. And with us here in studio, Jennifer Jeffs, President and CEO at the Canadian International Council. Judith Teachman, Professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. And Carlo Dade, Senior Fellow at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. And as I welcome everybody to the program, we have to do one piece of business before we start. We have to offer congratulations to the newest Canadian citizen at our table, Carlo Dade. How long have you been a Canadian citizen for?
Since 9:30 this morning.
Congratulations.
Hours or so.
Well done.
Thank you.
You're from the States originally?
Yeah, I had to swear allegiance to the Queen, apologize for 1776, 1812, and aver that softwood stumpage fees on provincial level are just and fair. So,
Carlo, all is forgiven. Welcome to being a Canadian. Okay, everybody sit tight because we're going to do a little business here as well as we set up our discussion on Mexico tonight. Michael, if you would, let's bring this up. Here is Mexico. We all know where it is. Mexico City, the capital. This is an enormous country to the south of the United States, and those shadings are significant insofar as the shadier it is, the more dangerous it is, and that adjective is correct. Population, 113 million people. It is the 11th most populous country in the world. They have 31 states and one federal district, Mexico City, like Washington, D.C. Gross domestic product, 1.5 trillion plus. That's the 12th largest economy in the world. Canada, by comparison, is smaller, just 1.33 trillion. Let's continue. An estimated 3 to 4% of Mexico's annual GDP is from the illegal drug trade. That's $30 billion annually. Now, this from Brett Stevens of the Wall Street Journal to set up our discussion. Then there is the numbing regularity with which news of drug-related atrocities dominates the international media's coverage of Mexico. The decapitation of 27 Guatemalan farmhands by the Zetas gang 2 weeks ago. The 146 corpses discovered in April in mass graves in the state of Durango. The hanging in March of 5 victims from bridges in the resort town of Mazatlan, and on and on and on. Yet a funny thing happened on the way to Mexico becoming another failed state. To wit, the failed state boomed. In 2010, a year when there were more than 15,000 drug-related killings, the economy grew by 5.5%, the fastest rate in a decade. The Mexican peso appreciated against the dollar. Inflation was essentially flat. Foreign reserves rose to 113 billion. 22 million tourists visited the country. Trade with the U.S. reached an all-time high of nearly $400 billion. The percentage of the population living below the poverty line declined to 47.4% in 2008, from 63.7% a decade earlier. Literacy rates surpassed 90%. Life expectancy continues to rise to near first world levels. In the U.S., sociologists are puzzling over the paradox of falling crime rates in an era of high unemployment and economic uncertainty. The Mexican paradox appears to be the reverse. Okay, that's the background. Let's start our discussion here. And Eric, let me go to you first in Washington. Is Mexico winning or losing, in your view, the war on drugs that President Calderon launched when he came to power?
Well, I think all the evidence is that they're losing at the moment, or at least not winning the war. As you pointed out, the body count is extraordinarily high. Levels of public concern and lack of support for government strategy is low, well below 50%. So, I mean, it depends which indicators you want to look at. But as a simple matter, I think you could say they're not winning the war, and there's probably a lot of ways in which they're failing.
Nick Steinberg, what do you say to that?
I agree with Eric that they are not winning the war. The metrics of violence show clearly that violence has increased with every year of President Calderon's presidency. However, what has not kept track with the increase in violence is an increase in criminal investigations, in holding people accountable who are responsible for crimes or even determining who they are. And what is a very important indicator for us, this rise in violence has also been accompanied by a significant increase in human rights abuses by security forces.
Jennifer Jeffs, clearly not a failed state, as many people like to popularly allege, but are they winning the war on drugs?
I would say that the war is making some, I think there's progress in the war itself. It's a changed war from what it was at the beginning. We now see a real consolidation of power between the two major cartels, the Sinaloa gang and the Zetas, and I would say that this is part of a process that is going to take a long time, and everybody always knew it was going to take a long time.
Judith Teachman?
Well, you know, first of all, I don't think you ever really win the war on drugs. You just push it to another place. I don't think Mexico's winning the war on drugs. The levels of violence are extremely high and accelerating. And I don't know whether you're going to come back to some of the points you raised in your introduction, but I would take issue with some of the positive spin put on some of the statistics you related. Sure, it's true, Mexico's economy is growing, but it declined by 6% in 2009. It was very sluggish growth during the 2000s, and there was a huge crisis in 1995. So Mexico has had periods of high growth, but many more periods of low growth. And another set of statistics that I think needs to be borne in mind, which is directly related to the drug trade, and that is the high level of poverty. Poverty increased in the year 2011, and inequality is very high. And inequality and poverty have been linked to high levels of criminal violence.
Poverty increased everywhere in the world in 2011, didn't it?
Not everywhere in the world.
Well, not everywhere.
Not everywhere in the world. But it increased significantly. It's been increasing in Mexico since 2003.
Okay.
Okay.
Carlo, how would you answer the question?
The struggle against the rise of the narco cartels throughout the Americas has been an issue of, and it's been a problem, not just for Mexico, but for countries throughout the hemisphere. To say that anyone is winning this war would be difficult. There have been some successes, Colombia. Mexico is in the initial stages still, despite 5 years of Calderon's war on the cartels. It's still, to some degree, in the initial stages of confronting the rise of the cartels. You need to restructure the police, restructure the judiciary. Civil society has to respond. And the Mexicans, to some degree, are still in the initial stages of doing this. We see some positive signs. Homicide rates are down in Ciudad Juarez, which had the highest homicide rate of any city on the globe, yet they started to spring up elsewhere around the country. So on the one hand, you do see some progress. The Mexicans are turning the ship of state around to deal with this, but it's like turning around the QE2. It takes a long time to rebuild and strengthen institutions that you need to confront this problem.
It's an appalling thing to say, Eric, but the reality is we here in Canada are far enough away from Mexico, unlike, say, in the southern United States, that we haven't heard that much. I mean, but 46,000 people dying in a drug war over the last 5 years, and we actually haven't heard that much about it. Are they making any progress in preventing people from being killed down there?
Well, you know, not too much. I mean, you know, there's, within all the bad news, maybe there is some small good news. I think one of the guests pointed out that the extraordinarily high levels of violence and murder in Ciudad Juarez dropped in 2011 probably by as much as 30%. It's gone up in other places and compensated for that. But, you know, if you're sitting in Ciudad Juarez, that's good news. You're somewhat less violent. You know, another part of this, and this is statistics again, you know, there have been double-digit increases in murder rates the last 2 years. In 2009, last year, in 2010, it was up again another 50 to 60%. This year, when, you know, at the end of the year, we think the increase in murders will be 10%. Is that good news? Well, you know, in a relative sense, it's good news, but it's still the highest murder rate in Mexico in modern times. So maybe the rapid increase in murders is slowing down, but, you know, still a long ways from really bringing this problem under control.
But Judith, to your point, if it's down in Juarez, it's probably because it's up in Monterrey.
Yes, or it's moving into Central America. So that will be the next problem.
To your point, you don't really win this thing. You never
win it, no.
You move it somewhere else.
No.
Carlo, I want to do...
Well,
sorry, okay, you want to follow up on that?
Well, I wouldn't be so fatalistic about it. I do think there are things that can be done. I don't think it's hopeless. You know, I think to say you never win, you never turn a corner is sort of to give up. And I don't think the Mexicans, I don't think the U.S., I assume the Canadians aren't just ready to throw in the towel and give up. The risks are too high there as well. Sure, the progress is small. It's not, hugely visible. But we could, if we wanted to spend some time looking at areas where there is maybe some hope, we could identify them. And I don't think I would be just so, flip as to say, it's impossible, there's nothing that can be done. I do think there are things that can be done.
Well, Judith, you want to come back at that?
Sure. I think there's things that can be done, but I think one of the problems with the Mexican strategy, which is really the U.S. strategy, is to go at it from the point of view of beefing up the security forces and the military. If that's basically the only thing you're doing, it's not going to work out well. You need to do a lot of other things. You need to look to institutions, and you need to have a development strategy, because the vast majority of people involved in drug trafficking are poor people. NAFTA opened up the floodgates to the importation of grain. Farmers went out of business and they went to the growing of drugs. So you need development strategies. You need a multi-pronged approach.
We are going to get to that. Nick, I saw you trying to get in out of town.
Yes, I just wanted to make the point that looking at the success or the failure of the strategy only in terms of casualty rates, I think, is a gross oversimplification. If we ask the question of whether Mexico has acknowledged the nature of the problem and really taken an approach that addresses it in its full complexity, I really have to say that their approach has been purely predicated on force. Let's not even speak of rebuilding institutions. Building institutions for the first time, like a functioning justice system, like a police force that Mexico can trust, does take time, but the little effort that has been made so far, and it has been very small in terms of resources and a public commitment on the part of the authorities, has not been up to the task of the crisis at hand. And that means that Mexico has to do a lot more from the president on down, in one, acknowledging that they are in a serious crisis, but also being frank about the kinds of solutions that it will take. And that goes beyond sending soldiers into the street, which we have seen has been a grossly inadequate solution for the problem.
I mentioned a little earlier, and Carlo, I'm going to get you to help me with this here, that we haven't had a lot of coverage in the Canadian press about this issue, about the tens of thousands of dead in Mexico. Look at the monitor over my shoulder there, and we're going to bring up a series of pictures here. Michael, I'm in the middle of page 3. Okay, you're on it. This is, I want you to take us through these and tell us what we're seeing here. This is in Juarez, I believe.
It looks like a car bomb or an attack in the city. You've seen use of heavy machine guns, heavy weapons, including explosives, Army-grade, weapons-grade explosives by the cartels.
This looks like a hit.
Yeah. The numbers of bodies, murders on a daily basis. Ciudad Juarez has the highest murder rate of any city on the globe in 2010.
This is it Caleta Beach, Acapulco? Is that how it's pronounced?
Narco Polo is the new name for the city.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's the nickname. Okay, we got a few more of these. Let's keep sending these through. This is Mata Zetas and the New Generation Capture. What's this?
Well, every time you have the government strategy has been correct, security and force, and every time there is a major arrest of CAPAs for the cartels, they line them up to show success, to show people that something is being done.
That was El Terry we just saw, the alleged leader of the Mexican La Familia drug cartel, and then those are the full resources of the army. How much does the violence intrude on people's daily lives?
It depends on where you are. There's some parts of Mexico where the homicide rate, which is a good indicator of violence, it's not the best indicator, but it's probably the best that we have. There's parts of Mexico, states where the homicide rate is as low or lower than it is in Canada. But there are other places, I mentioned Ciudad Juarez, the highest murder rate, homicide rate of any city. If you look at the top 10 or top 20 cities by homicide, a good chunk of them are in Mexico. So in those places, it's a major problem. But then again, Mexico City, there are more people, or practically as many people in Mexico City as in Canada.
Right.
And yet the homicide rate there is not what you see along the northern border.
So Nick, I should follow up with you on that. The places that Canadians and Americans go to vacation, for the most part, Puerto Vallarta, these kinds of places, they're never going to run into this kind of crime there, are they?
Well, Acapulco was a major tourist destination for Americans and also for Canadians, and now it is, this year, the second most dangerous city in Mexico. And to your question of the impact on everyday lives of Mexicans, I can tell you we spent the last 2 years doing research in Mexico on the impact of this public security policy, and specifically human rights abuses. And the levels of fear are so high right now that we had an experience going into a community in Nuevo León where we had heard that people had been disappeared by the Navy. And the levels of fear were so high that we went and interviewed one family whose son had been taken by the Navy in the middle of the night and still has not been found. We talked to their neighbors, and we realized that 12 people from a very small neighborhood had been taken within the same series of days of each other. But none of them had spoken to each other, and none of them had reported the crimes to authorities because they were so afraid that there would be repercussions. So the violence that we hear about and the pieces that we get are only a tiny fraction of the problems and the people that are affected by the violence in Mexico. So I don't think we can overestimate the impact of this on the Mexican population.
Jennifer?
And I think that's what the gangs are counting on, the violence and the fear. Fear is a strategy there. There's a military strategy on the part of these two major cartels. The Zetas are, they're former military people. They're military people who defected from the military in Mexico and Guatemala, and they have a strategy of fear that they're imposing on the populations, the extortion that they're demanding, the way that they're running those neighborhoods and those communities is through the process of fear. So I think that it's a definite strategy, and I think that it's very important to remember that this is a war between the cartels, not just Calderon's war. It's a war between the cartels for power.
Carlo?
What you don't see with the violence is the other corrosive impact of the situation in Mexico, the weakening of institutions in the country, institutions such as the rule of law, confidence in the government, confidence that the government can protect you. The Army had always been, the armed forces had always been the second most trusted institution in Mexico. And their involvement in human rights abuses, being forced into an unwinnable situation. Armies can't do policing. It's a train wreck waiting to happen. Everybody knows this. The Army's put in a situation where they're going to be involved in these sorts of things. So you weaken not just belief in the government, but also society, your neighbors, communities. It's a corrosive impact, and that's what you don't see in the pictures.
Eric, I'm going to play a piece of tape here, and I want you to comment on it first, if you would. This is a TED Talk. It's the son of the former President Carlos Salinas, Emiliano. His response to the violence that's taking place in Mexico. Let's play this tape, and then I'll put a question to you. Michael, if you would, roll the tape.
México tenemos un problema, tenemos un gran problema. Esto creo que hay consenso, creo que nadie lo debate, estamos todos de acuerdo. En lo que no estamos de acuerdo es en cuál es el problema que tenemos. ¿Son los Zetas? ¿Es el narco? ¿Es el gobierno? ¿Es la corrupción? ¿Es la pobreza? ¿O algo más? Yo creo que ninguno de esos es el problema. No digo que no sean cosas a atender, pero no vamos a poder atender ninguna de esas cosas si no resolvemos primero el verdadero problema que tenemos en México. El verdadero problema que tenemos en México es que la mayoría de los mexicanos nos asumimos como víctimas de nuestras circunstancias. Somos un país de víctimas.
Eric, he's saying people don't agree on what the problem is, but in his view, the problem is that Mexicans see themselves only as victims. And he believes that Mexicans have got to stop thinking of themselves as victims and take back their streets and their daily lives. Do you think that's possible?
Well, you know, in theory it's possible. Obviously, if you're living in Mexico City, it's more possible than if you're living in Monterrey or Culiacan, some of the areas where it's most violent. That's the challenge. One of the ways that violence has impacted civil society, if you will, the citizens themselves, as it's focused in part on journalists and journalism. And so the reporting and information about what's going on is so limited in these key areas. So it makes, frankly, action, civic engagement much more difficult, especially, not only, but especially in those areas of high crime, high violence. And the other aspect of this is what we call state capture. In other words, where the state is captured actually by criminal gangs. Where that's happening, I mean, it's happening all over Mexico, but it's particularly acute in some of these areas of high concentration and presence of organized crime groups. You know, when you have a situation where the police are not carrying out actual legitimate policing functions, it's pretty hard for citizens to mobilize and try to demand things from the government. despite that, it is happening. There's a burgeoning and growing victims movement, if I can use that word, a movement of people, family members who have lost loved ones, who are demanding action by their government. But even they have been the targets of violence at recent times. 2 weeks ago, one of their activists was murdered, and they've even found it difficult. So you have a situation where there's enormous distrust in the government, and public mobilization is quite difficult. He has a point. I personally, and this is a personal opinion, believe that citizens have to begin to demand more of their government, expect more, and engage with government more directly, because the government left on its own clearly hasn't been up to the task. But it's incredibly difficult. I think it would be naive to say that it's just a simple matter of organizing and speaking out.
Judith, you want to follow?
Yes, I mean, I agree with what's just been said. It's interesting that this was a Salinas that made that remark because, of course, Raul Salinas, Carlos's brother, was very much involved in drug trafficking. He was integrally involved during the regime of Carlos Salinas. So this sounds to me like an attempt to blame the people that are being victimized by the drug traffickers. And I would agree it's extraordinarily difficult to mobilize and to confront drug trafficking. If you do so, you put your life in jeopardy. I mean, there's a vast literature on the Colombian case and what happened to the leaders of social movements when they tried to do this. It's extremely dangerous. A policeman, if he rejects a bribe, not only rejects the money that the bribe would entail, which he probably needs to live on, but puts his whole family in jeopardy. And one of the things that's been happening is that they've been targeting the children of policemen and military men who refuse to take bribes and go along with what the drug cartels want. So I think there's no question that people are restricted from what they can do, from the sheer violence of the situation. I think it's fine to sit here and say social movements should do more, but we've really never been in that context and don't recognize how terrifying it is.
Nick, is the messenger in that case the wrong messenger for that message?
It's hard to separate the messenger.
No, I'm sorry, that's for Nick Steinberg.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, I would say yes, it is the wrong messenger, but frankly, it's not been a very different message from President Calderon. You know, his discourse has been that 90%, and I believe this is a point that Jennifer made, that 90% of the victims of the violence in Mexico are narcos killed by their narcos or attacked by their narcos. And frankly, there is no empirical evidence for behind these statements because there is no culture of investigation in Mexico. I'll give you one statistic that shows, I think, how little we know about who the victims of these killings are in Mexico. Of the 40-odd thousand homicides at the time that we made this public information request in Mexico that had been registered by the federal government, the federal prosecutor's office has only opened 997 investigations. These are just open investigations into those homicides. Of those investigations, they've only charged approximately 320 people and convicted 22 people of drug-related homicides. Now, what does that tell us? What it tells us is that the general conventional wisdom out there, that this is simply cartel-on-cartel violence, is unsubstantiated by the facts. And furthermore, because we have cases where violence committed by the state has been pawned off on the cartels, I think it's reasonable to ask, to what degree is the violence that's being attributed to, we can concede, very, very dangerous and very violent cartels, actually partially on the shoulders of the state?
Carlo.
To be fair to Emilio in the clip, and you can see it online at TED Talks, he lists the people from whom Mexicans are victims, the Spanish, the French, the Americans, and he mentions Salinas. He mentions his father and his family.
Not Raul, though.
Did he mention the uncle? That's the question.
He mentioned the family, I think, but he definitely mentioned his father as part of the long train of those who have victimized Mexico. But in terms of responding, we've identified needs to reform the judiciary. Our friend in New York has pointed that out. The need to reform the police, but you're also going to need changes in civil society. I mean, what we've seen in the case of Colombia, turning around institutions took a long time. It took the Colombians a long time to wake up to the need to invest in social programs. But if you look in Colombia nowadays, the U.S. Plan Colombia money has shifted from security to investments on the social side.
Yeah.
The Colombians are talking to the Mexicans. So it's not just civil society groups and academics talking to the Mexicans. The Colombians are there extensively saying, look, the security thing is important, but you're also going to have to make investigations. You're going to have to make investments in building institutions. Killing the narcos is not the metric you want. It's killing and also prosecuting. The prosecutions have to be up higher or higher than the number of those that you've killed or captured.
Doesn't sound from Nick like they're doing much of a job on that.
They're still starting out.
They're just starting out.
The amount of investment that you need to get them where they need to be, the amount of money that went into Colombia to get Colombia, a much smaller country, to the point where they could begin to manage the issue was massive. Mexico's just beginning.
I'm going to read something here from El Diario. It's an editorial, and then Jennifer, I'll get you to comment on it first. This is about the rules of the game for the media. And they put this in an editorial in El Diario. As information workers, we want you to explain to us, you people in the drug cartels, that what you want from us, what can we try to publish, or what should we stop publishing so that we know what we should abide by. You are, at present, the de facto authorities in this city, because the authorities, despite our repeated demands, have not been able to prevent the death of our colleagues. That is why, faced with this unobjectionable reality, we are writing to you to ask these questions, because the last thing we want is for another of our colleagues to be a shooting victim. In essence, have the media been silenced in Mexico?
I would say that that is definitely a very big problem. It's a very big problem, and it's a problem that that I think we should be aware of as NAFTA partners, and that the U.S. needs to be aware of as a NAFTA partner, and as a culpable agent in all this as well. Where are the guns coming from? Where is the demand for the drugs coming from? Largely from the U.S. So I think we really want to shift some of the conversation as to, you know, these. Yes, the government has to do more, but let's help the government to do more. You know, we're sitting and watching and criticizing, and they're not doing enough. But there are things that we can do, and there's a lot we are doing. We are doing things. We are helping with judicial reforms, with fiscal reforms, all those reforms that are so important for more investment to go into Mexico, for development to take place, as Judith says. I mean, this is the essential problem. It is a development problem. But I think that it's in terms of how the media is reacting. Certainly in Ciudad Juarez, that was a terrible situation, an absolutely terrible situation.
Nick, have the media been silenced in Mexico?
I don't think they've been silenced, but they're certainly under threat. I mean, the paper, Diario publishes every day. Journalists go in and they do their reporting, and they do it in Juarez, they do it in Monterrey, they do it in Culiacan. But I think, to the point that Eric made before, human rights defenders, journalists, civil society leaders are our canaries in the mine in Mexico. And they are the people that have taken the greatest risks, along with the victims of families who have denounced their cases publicly, in calling attention to what are endemic problems. And when the Mexican state doesn't take the steps necessary to protect them, as well as, I mean, I don't think we can expect more of the cartels, but what we can expect of a government, and this is something, we don't think that the Colombian government did many things admirably in its counter-narcotics campaign. But one thing that they did do well is they created a protection mechanism for journalists and human rights defenders. Mexico has announced a mechanism like this, but in terms of putting into practice, they've done virtually nothing. And the result is that human rights defenders and journalists are being killed at a higher rate than ever before in Mexico. And these are people who have asked for protection from the state. We need to protect those people. The U.S. can help with that, and Canada can help with that as well.
Well, in which case, let's ask Judith whether the drug wars, or how much the drug wars, have eroded the public's confidence in their government in Mexico.
Well, that's a tough question to ask, because when you try to answer that question, you go to public opinion polls. So the latest poll I saw on support for Calderon's drug policy suggested that something like 50% of the population supported what he was doing. An analysis said the problem with that question was that there's not a distinction between what he wants to achieve and the methods that he uses to achieve it. So there's probably 50% of Mexicans who definitely want the drug cartels dealt with. Whether they want it dealt with in the way Calderon is doing it is, I think, an open question, despite the results of that survey. There have been large-scale protests against the way he's been handling the drug issue. So I would say that probably as we speak, the support for his methods are very rapidly eroding.
Let me find out about those methods. Eric, can you tell us why you think Calderon, I mean, he obviously had a decision to make, any number of different ways to approach this, but he went for an all-out war on the drug cartels. Why did he choose that approach?
Well, I think it came from a sense of crisis in parts of the country where it was clear that the state police, the local police were completely overwhelmed, that there was not a functioning judicial system, and there were pleas for help, first from the state of Michoacan, then from the state of Chihuahua, and other places from the central government, feeling overwhelmed, outmanned, outgunned, and he turned to what he felt, and I would disagree, but what he felt was his best tool and option at the moment, which was calling out the military and helping not only confront organized crime, but trying to restore some sense of order and protection on the streets of Ciudad Juarez and Morelia, Michoacan, and other places. In the end, that strategy has not turned out to be very effective. It's exacerbated conflicts between organized crime groups. It's as been indicated here, it's sort of a one-note strategy. It's not a more diverse strategy. The Mexican government, to their credit, has articulated a fuller, more complex strategy of institutional reform and strengthening, social investments. But at the end of the day, the emphasis has been primarily on what's known as a high-value target strategy, going after leaders of particular organizations. That's where the real emphasis is. And that is, at the end of the day, in my opinion, what's contributed to a dramatic rise in the violence in Mexico.
Let me get Jennifer's view on this. A good idea to go for an all-out war against the drug cartels?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I think that a statement definitely was made that they were going to be under attack, and that this was not acceptable. That this government was not going to stand up and it was not going to sit and just sit by and watch this happen. I think that I don't think that the war is getting less popular with people. I think people are thinking. My feeling is that people think maybe the worst of the violence is behind them now that there is this settling down and this kind of some accommodations between the two gangs. And the violence, the pockets of violence are really limited to 5 states. That's really the biggest violent areas are in the 5 states. And I think that people are realizing there's a lot of talk about, okay, if these gangs can accommodate with each other, there will be less fear, there will be less violence, there will be less intimidation, and we can live a more peaceful life.
Nick, what do you say?
I think that the idea that there is a consolidation of violence is not at all supported by the facts. In fact, the violence has spread to states like Veracruz over the past year that until recently were totally untouched by this kind of violence. And also the idea that there's just a bifurcation of 2 cartels. In fact, what we've seen, and Eric mentioned this, is a splintering of cartels as a result of the government's strategy of going after high-value targets and many more actors in play. I think that the idea also that I'd like to challenge here is that this idea that there's a line between the state actors on the one side and the cartels, the good guys, and the bad guys on the other side, I think is completely not borne out by the reality on the ground. When you go to these cities, places like Monterrey, and you look at the police departments, local police departments and local organized crime groups are indistinguishable. They're one and the same. And so you need a strategy that reflects that complexity and starts to rebuild those institutions so that when civilians are caught in the middle of this very, very violent fight, that they have someone to go to. And right now, that's not happening, that institution building.
Carlo.
One of the ways that's born...
Stand by for a second, Eric. Stand by. I got Carlo first.
Okay.
Very quickly, in terms of the popularity or the public perception and support, it's not just the public in which you want to look. You want to look at the political elites, too. Within Calderon's own party, the PAN, the National Action Party, there's been disagreement over the strategy. Very early on, his chief spokesperson, I think it was Ramon Aguilar, came out and questioned the strategy. Maybe we should look at negotiating with the cartels. Vicente Fox has been very critical of the war that his predecessor, his successor has undertaken. So there's debate within the elites, and as we see a new election in Mexico for the president coming next year, in July we'll have a new president, it will be a subject in the debates, and it's not at all clear that any of the other candidates for president or any of the parties, or even that the PAN itself, the current ruling party, supports this.
Eric, you wanted to say?
Boy, I almost forgot what I was going to say. I think some of the what Nick was pointing out is borne out by some of the analysis of what are called victimization surveys. There have been for years national victimization surveys where you ask victims of crime, did you report, what happened to you? And the data, varies a little bit, but roughly between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 crimes are actually even reported. We're not talking about adjudicated, just reported. So that means really almost 80%, 75% of crimes never get reported from the beginning. The reason for that is various, but the primary reasons given is not trust in the authorities. It's a waste of time. It's too much paperwork involved, and fear of repercussions of reporting crime. I think those statistics are the best indicators of the separation that exists, the gulf, the canyon, if you will, between the citizens and its own authorities. The citizens, if somebody breaks into my house and steals my TV, have to ask the question, am I going to go down to the precinct and report it or not? And clearly, the majority of people are not. Those crimes are not being reported that go way beyond just this narco violence that we've been talking about. There's a gulf that exists between the state and society that's really not, that's been in existence for quite some time. And I think until you deal with that, until there's public confidence in the authorities, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult for the Mexican government to be successful.
Judith, let me try this with you, though. I mean, presumably the president had a range of options in front of him. One was all-out war on the cartels. Another was, okay, let's make a deal. You guys can control these provinces here, and we won't get in your way, but we don't want any violence spilling over to any of the other provinces. Would that have been a better choice to make?
Well, actually, that's kind of what the PRI did, the Institutionalized Revolutionary Party. When it was in power, it controlled the drug cartels from the top and allowed them to operate in exchange for a piece of the action. The PAN, I think to its credit, wanted to depart from the PRI experience. It wanted to be the uncorrupt political party. It wanted to reform the Mexican political system. I think there's lots of people that were leaders of the PAN who had a real objective in that direction. So I think it partly stems from a naivete of what was possible in the Mexican context. But they did have other choices. I think that they disregarded the development side of it. The fact that many tens of thousands of people join drug cartels. They're the mules, they join the Zetas, they draw very much from the youth, the unemployed youth. The PAN administration has never considered this a development issue, and so it does not have a multifaceted approach to all of this. It may be considering institutional reform, but it is not considering the development side, and you have to do all of these things if you're really going to be any success.
Nick, I want to read something from the Harper's Magazine issue that is just out now. It's actually dated January of 2012, but it's just out now. And this is all about Calderon's war and the military angle in this. Then I'll come out with a question for you. Before, the dead came from the middle ranks of the drug hierarchy, municipal or state police officers, or men in their 20s and 30s who wore good clothes, drove nice cars, and often owned bars, restaurants, car dealerships, or auto repair shops they used as fronts. These were oficiales. They took orders from bosses or patrones who didn't even live in Juarez. After the soldiers arrived, the carnage shifted to the bottom of the drug pyramid. Now the victims included addicts, pushers, and small-time criminals once considered inconsequential players. As claims of violations increased, the military's leadership denied all charges, maintaining that the rising body count was simply fallout from the Sinaloa and Juarez drug war. Historically, the military investigated itself rather than submit to civilian courts, so there was no way for anyone to know the truth. That's what Harper's found. Now, you've done some investigating on this on your own. What have you found?
The practice in Mexico, when the military is alleged to have committed an abuse, and over this period of Calderon's presidency, there have been 6,000 complaints of grave abuses by the military. The pattern is that you send the investigation to the military justice system. That's the practice. What we've seen is that is nearly a guaranteed recipe for impunity. Of all of the investigations that the military has opened into abuses, and it's opened about 3,700 in this administration, it's only sentenced 29 people. Why is that the case? The military, in these investigations, protects its own. And the way we see that reflected is in cases we've documented, cases where the military, we have clear evidence that the military has executed people or tortured people or disappeared people. And this means we have videos of the military picking people up. We have medical exams of people who leave military bases that have no fingernails left on their hands. We have witnesses who've seen the military kill people and then pawn the crime off on cartels. In none of these cases do we see an investigation. The military doesn't go to the crime scene and actually interview the witnesses, or they do, and then the case gets passed from one military prosecutor to another. So one of our key pushes that we've made, and we made this last month when we met with President Calderon, is you have to take these cases out of military courts. Why? Because not only for human rights reasons, not only do we need the rule of law, but really, if people lose confidence in the military, and they lose confidence in all of the security forces, Mexico is going to lose the critical counterintelligence that it needs to address what is a very serious security problem. And that's what we think is the future, and that's what's coming unless Mexico pulls these investigations into the civilian justice system, which is where they belong.
Carlo.
And to be fair, the military is aware of this as an issue. And when we talk about the military in Mexico, it's important to distinguish between the Navy and the Army. These are two groups with separate histories, separate ideologies, separate ways of working.
Is one more trusted than the other?
Yes, yes, the Navy. If the Navy in Mexico were ever to become corrupted, then it's pretty much game over in the country. To this degree, we haven't seen this happen with the Navy. We have to some degree seen it with the Army. There have been questions about Army units, and not just in terms of human rights violations, but in terms of cooperation with the cartels. We haven't seen the same degree of charges against the Navy, and even trust between the Army and Navy in Mexico today isn't what it was years ago because of the involvement of the two sides in the war on drugs. But what's important to bear in mind is, especially groups like the Navy, they're worried about loss of reputation. They're worried about the corrosion of their reputation, about their institution. So they're aware of the issue. In terms of dealing with the human rights abuses, it's interesting. Mexico has very strong human rights institutions. There's a National Council on Human Rights that has done investigations in the drug war, looking at police killings. They can't do killings by the military, but there have been some small signs. So there is a potential. There are things upon which you can build in Mexico.
Jennifer, the president clearly seems committed to this war on drugs still. Do you think local government officials, municipal officials, governors in smaller states, is that support still there?
It's much more difficult for them. It's much more difficult for them. And let's not forget that Mexico is it's a fledgling democracy still. So they are, they're looking for the leadership of the president that they've elected. And I think that's a key issue here, that the institutions are being built, the reforms still need to be affected, and we need to help them. We also need to help them. I always come back to that I think there's a role here that we can play and that the Americans can play.
Well, in fact, we posted up just a second ago on the screen the fact that you've written an op-ed piece for our website, Mexico's problem is Canada's problem, and why we should be involved in that. So I would draw people's attention to our website once, of course, they're finished watching this program. But it does raise another question, Judith, and that is, if this is a fledgling democracy, and if they're having tens of thousands of people killed in a drug war, what are we doing in NAFTA with them anyway?
Well, that question, of course, was very vehemently debated when we were negotiating NAFTA. I mean, there was a lot of problems with Mexican democracy back then. And I would venture to say there are probably even more problems now. There are different problems, but there are even more problems. But the fact is we've already signed NAFTA, so we're in it with them.
Do we belong in it with them? Does it still make sense?
Well, I think the question that should be asked, does it make sense for the Mexicans? Because increasingly, the question of has NAFTA been beneficial to Mexico has been raised, particularly for the farm sector, which was decimated when the floodgates were opened to grain imports after 1995. Most observers say that Mexico has not benefited from NAFTA in the way it was envisioned that it would. Now, of course, the counter-argument is, well, things might have been much worse without it, but we will never know that. Sure. So I think that's a very difficult question to ask. We are already in NAFTA with Mexico. So I think the more important question is, what is our role in NAFTA, given the kinds of problems we've been discussing here?
And perhaps, you know, more appropriately, Eric, for the United States, since it's closer, has much more direct ties. There's that border, after all. Can America still play a constructive role in making Mexico not just a fledgling democracy, but a democracy more like yours or ours?
Well, I mean, there's limits to what the United States can do in Mexico on the democracy front. I mean, you know, they can speak out forcefully and support institutional reform, you know, better training for the justice sector and the police and so on and so forth. You know, those are important things. But at the end of the day, I think the ability of the United States to sort of impose those things on Mexico is fairly limited. Probably what the most important things the U.S. can do for Mexico are in the United States, which have to do with trying to reduce consumption of drugs, trying to stop the flow of weapons into Mexico, and trying to disrupt the laundering of money that comes back to Mexico and feeds this whole enterprise. U.S. can do things in Mexico. They should do things. They should support Mexico. But, you know, frankly, at the end of the day, I think those things pale in comparison to what the U.S. could do at home.
Carlo.
But there are things that the United States can do vis-a-vis the security situation in Mexico. One of the calculations that Calderon made, it's rumored when he came in, was expecting more from the United States in terms of assistance on the security front. Here you have a narco war along the border with the United States, a clear and present danger if ever there was one.
Well, what does that mean? Sending American troops down to Mexico?
Money, more assistance. They got $1.5 billion over 3 years, which sounds like a lot of money, but almost half of that was to buy airplanes and helicopters. It doesn't leave a lot for investments in the judiciary. It doesn't leave a lot to give more money to the United States Development Agency, which, unlike the Canadian Development Agency, still operates in Mexico. So the money that the U.S. has given has been held up in Congress. There have been fights about it. Do we really need to give this to Mexico? Can we really afford to give this much to Mexico? So I think that the United States has kind of left Mexico once again high and dry.
Judith?
Yeah, and I would say there needs to be a distinction in what the money is given for. I mean, it's gone into, as you say, security, buildup of security and training and for military reasons. It would probably be better put into development projects and other kinds of endeavors that would deal with some of the development issues involved. I mean, if you look at the Calderon administration, the proportion of social spending going to poverty alleviation programs has actually declined. It's been going down. So you're faced with a situation where you've got a Mexican government that is really moving away from development issues. And you've got a U.S. initiative, the Merida Initiative, for example, which is totally focused on security issues and the military defeat of the cartels. And I think that's really not addressing what I see as one of the major problems behind the drug trade and the reason people become involved in it.
To be fair, this was a lesson from Colombia too. I mean, initially, the battle in Colombia was security, then development.
Yeah.
So the best we can hope for in the situation is that we'll see the same thing in Mexico. But believe me, the Colombians are talking to the Mexicans, and the Mexican military is also. One of the strongest advocates in Mexico was the Navy for social investment, for poverty alleviation.
But Calderon is very deaf on that issue, unfortunately.
But the forces in Mexico pushing back against him.
Let me get Eric and then Nick.
Excuse me. I mean, I agree with the sentiment, but I just think it's an inaccurate statement to say all U.S. assistance is military focused. It's just not. I mean, they've gone steadily up, $100 million this coming year for social investment. Now, you all have said exactly what some of the problem is, that the Mexican government itself has been resistant to U.S. Aid in social development because they're a country with resources, as you said at the beginning, the 12th largest economy. They feel that they can do it themselves. But let's be a little more nuanced about what the U.S. aid package is, because there are very specific social investments. It's now the fourth pillar of the aid program that's going into 3 specific areas where there's been high violence, designed for social, what they call building resilient communities. We can debate whether that's going to be effective, whether they should do it differently, but to suggest that the only assistance going to Mexico is security and military focused, I think is just not an accurate statement.
Nick Steinberg.
Yeah, I agree completely with Eric. Initially, the Merida funding was almost entirely dedicated to military assistance. That's simply not the case anymore. There is a shift towards investing in the rule of law, and that's positive. Where I think both the U.S. and Canada can do more, and this comes from the leaders, it's from President Obama and from Prime Minister Harper, is actually acknowledging that Mexico is in a serious crisis and speaking frankly about the fact that something that we virtually all agreed on at the beginning, that the strategy's been a failure. And on the contrary, what we've seen when Calderon came to Washington and when he was in Ottawa last year was Prime Minister Harper last year and Obama more recently saying that Calderon has taken a courageous stand to combat the cartels, and we support him 100% in his strategy. Being a good partner to Mexico, and this goes for the United States and for Canada, means acknowledging the crisis that they're in and speaking about what possible alternatives and changes of course could be charted. And at the highest public levels right now, that's not happening from either country, and it ought to.
Jennifer, we've got about a minute and a half left, and I'm going to put an idea on the table here that will solve this whole problem. How about legalizing drugs? Would that take the steam out of all this?
Oh, of course it would. Of course it would. But
is that an idea worth considering?
Absolutely, and a lot of people are considering it. The
former
presidents of Colombia, of Brazil, of Mexico, of Switzerland they all put out a big report a few months ago saying that this was, it's an obvious. Look at everybody's watching that PBS show on prohibition, and people who you would never dream of saying maybe it's a good idea are suddenly saying this could be the answer. But what that would take, the political will, especially in the United States, it's hard to imagine.
Would that, Judith? Would that take a lot of the gas out of this fire?
Absolutely.
It would.
It would. Once you remove the fact that it is a criminal activity, then the motivation to become involved in it goes down the drain. People, the high profits are no longer there. The need to bribe government officials and recruit people for armies to pursue the drug trade disappears. So yes, if in
Nick,
a perfect world,
I got 20 seconds. Nick, you wanted on whether or not we should legalize drugs?
I think I just want to say that less than half of the cartel's profits now are generated from drugs. They're generated from other illicit businesses like trafficking migrants. So it's a bigger problem now than drugs, and we can't solve it just with that simple fix alone.
Gotcha. I want to thank all 5 of you for coming on TVO tonight. Part 3 of Countries Week here on TVO. Mexico tonight, Russia tomorrow night, Canada on Friday. My thanks to Eric Olson from the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., Nick Steinberg in New York City from Human Rights Watch. Thanks to you two for participating this evening. Jennifer Jeffs from the Canadian International Council here in Toronto. There's Jennifer on the left. Carlo Dade, our new Canadian citizen from the University of Ottawa on the right. And Judith Teachman from the Munk School of Global Affairs in Toronto. Thanks all for participating tonight.